So this will be my last lecture on the Progressive Era. What we're going to look at today is Woodrow Wilson, the last progressive president, some of the big laws that were passed that really still affect your life today. And when we get to the end, we'll talk a little bit about the legacy of the Progressive Era and what that means in terms of understanding history. In my last lecture, I talked about the election of 1912 and how Teddy Roosevelt tried to become president again but failed. And as a result, Democrat Woodrow Wilson becomes president in 1912. He takes office in 1913. Wilson was a Democrat who was from the South. So if you read through this slide a little bit, you'll see, he had Confederate sympathies, and he very much had several racial prejudices. In all of the progressive reforms, some things do have progress and some things do help and some things don't get a whole lot better. Race issues by the end of the 19 teens have not gotten a lot better. And that's one of the reasons why our country has such a long history on race relations. And we're going to need a stronger civil rights movement later on in our history. But Woodrow Wilson, he was from the South. He was also however, very moral in terms of having a sense of right and wrong. He was very academic. He's the only president we've ever had with a PhD. He went to an Ivy League college. He was actually the president of Princeton College before he became president. So a very smart guy, a very moral guy, but also has many of the prejudices of his time. This cartoon kind of shows him as like a Roman consul. This kind of owl here in the background is meant to show that he's wise and has wisdom, and he's going to make good decisions. So what does he do? What are some of the big things? Now, these won't sound super interesting when I go through the laws, but they do have a big impact on your life. Wilson, he wanted to attack what he called the triple wall of privilege. So much like Teddy Roosevelt had the 3 C's, Woodrow Wilson has 3 big issues that he wants to tackle: the tariff, the bank, and the trust. We haven't talked a whole lot about tariffs, but to give you kind of just a cliff notes, tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. The simple rule of thumb is higher tariffs help businesses in America function. It protects them. However, higher tariffs often mean higher prices for American consumers. A lower tariff means that American businesses have to compete with goods from all over the world, and competition drives prices down. So the Cliff Notes understanding of tariffs is high tariffs generally mean high prices and they help business, but low tariffs means lower prices and helps consumers. Wilson wanted to bring the tariff down. He gets something called the Underwood tariff. It's real easy to remember. Under means the tariff's going down, and he believes this is going to help the average American in the progressive era, early 1900s. This cartoon is kind of a play on the Good Samaritan from the Bible stories. This person here laying down on the ground is called a consumer, and you can see that they're weak and beaten up, and it says the Good Samaritan. That's Woodrow Wilson, and he's sitting here helping the consumer with tariff reform. It says, and the 2 that passed by on the other side, that would be Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, the preceding presidents. So here is Wilson, the academic, the Democrat. That's why we have a donkey. And he's sitting here saying, look, I'm going to help the average American by lowering the tariff, when these other 2 guys just allowed business to flourish. People did object. They said, if you lower the tariff, how's the government going to make any money? And so this is where it affects you guys. When the tariff goes down and the government's not making as much money, where is that money going to come from? Well, Congress had just passed the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment is what's called a graduated income tax, or sometimes it's called a progressive income tax. Up to this point in American history, there was no income tax. When you worked, no taxes were taken out of your paycheck. based on your income. But now with a graduated income, the more money you earn, the more you're taxed. This income tax revenue will replace the lost revenue from the lower tariff. In general, what Wilson believed, and the way our tax code works, the richer class bears a higher burden, a higher percentage of the tax burden. So the more you make, the more you're taxed. The wealthy pay more taxes than the not wealthy. Again, this is meant to assist and help the average American, the consumer kind of working class. That's why this is seen as a progressive accomplishment. Lower the tariff and replace revenue for the very first time with income taxes. The second thing that Wilson wanted to tackle was the banking system. Our banking system in the early 1900s was still using the structure and the methods that we used in the mid 1800s. So it's very old. It's what's called inelastic, meaning that currency levels were not able to flex to meet demand. So we had an inelastic currency. Woodrow Wilson wants to reform that, and he does. He gets a law through Congress and he signs off on it known as the Federal Reserve Act. This creates what today we call the Fed or the Federal Reserve. It has a Federal Reserve Board that monitors our money supply. It took power away from big commercial banks and put oversight and regulation into the government's hands. Here's a picture of Wilson kind of standing over, and he's bringing the bankers to bear. Like he's breaking them down and saying, you're going to submit to the federal government. The Federal Reserve Board, it is appointed by the president. It has 12 regional districts, and it has the ability to issue things like paper money, to put money into circulation or take money out of circulation. If you pulled a dollar bill or any type of money out, what you're going to see on there is it's going to say Federal Reserve Note. These banking regulations and this banking system that Woodrow Wilson helped to create is what we still use over 100 years later. So again, very much impacting your life. The last goal that Wilson wanted to tackle was the trust. Much like Teddy Roosevelt wanted to regulate trust, Woodrow Wilson wanted to bring down the power of big business. Signed off on the Federal Trade Commission to investigate monopolies. This will help to stop things like false advertising, mislabeling, or price gouging. And finally, he signed off on the Clayton Antitrust Law. Prior to Clayton, there was what was called the Sherman Antitrust Law, and it was pretty good. Teddy Roosevelt had used it, but the Sherman Antitrust Law had also been used against labor unions. This Clayton Antitrust Act is a stronger antitrust law. It stops what are called interlocking directorates, where two companies are kind of linked by CEOs serving on each other's board of directors, where they're kind of interlocked like that. It prevents that. And it also exempted labor unions and the labor movement from being broken up with antitrust laws. So this is very good for labor unions. Here's a final cartoon of Woodrow Wilson, with his harpoon spear shooting down the octopus of interlocking directorates. And he's doing that in the name of business freedom. Woodrow Wilson believed if you brought down the big monopolies, small businesses would now be able to compete and flourish. The Clayton Antitrust Act is actually, a modified version of that is still the anti-monopoly laws that we use today. So Woodrow Wilson, amendments, laws, tariffs, banks, trusts. And I know none of that is really, really like fun stuff to learn, but all of it is still kind of being utilized 100 years later and has a big impact on your life. The last thing I want to show you to finish up this unit, to talk a little bit about the legacy of the Progressive Era. I want to go back to our unit page. And at the very beginning of this unit, I showed you a chart And it's down here, it says Progressive Era Concept Chart, and it looks like this. And on the left, it had Progressive Era problems, and then it had muckrakers, reformers, and solutions. I want you to see underneath that, I went ahead and put a filled in version of it. This could be a good kind of overview or a study guide almost for the Progressive Era. So what's the legacy here of the Progressive Era? We had problems from industrialization, urbanization, population growth. Our country grew rapidly in the late 1800s, and we had all of these problems. Well, the legacy of the Progressive Era is that a free press, muckrakers, investigated and exposed problems. A democratic people got active. Grassroots organizers began to mobilize government and mobilize the voice of the people to try to fix these problems. And in the end, our government passed democratically voted on legislation to try to fix these problems. Now, not all of these solutions, and we should put solutions in quote, not all of these solutions work or are necessarily good in the long run. For example, we passed the 18th Amendment, prohibition to ban alcohol because we thought alcohol was causing city crime and domestic violence. Well, it turns out when you get into the 1920s and 30s, there's just as much city crime and domestic violence when alcohol was banned. In fact, there might have been even more with the mob and the gangster activity. So it's not all of these Progressive Era solutions worked, but many were attempted. And this chart can show you amendments, the trust laws, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the consumer protections, women gaining the right to vote finally. Also note, as I said at the beginning of this, little to no successful solutions. That's not to minimize W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP, just knowing that there was still a lot of work to be done in terms of race relations after the Progressive Era. Okay, that's enough for today. Thanks for watching. We'll finish out this week with a couple, final progressive assignments, and then next week we will be starting into some foreign policy. We'll talk about imperialism and World War I in our next unit. Thank you, guys. See you later.